Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Up from Slavery, chapters 10 and 11, starting on page 148.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, Oni, from the Pro-Black Perspective. Thanks for tuning in. I know that Anthony McPhail is here, the Forecast is here, Sister Raw and the elders that listen with her are here, the children from Jesse's Kids are here, the children from the Daycare Ladies Network are here, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is here, and so is Afro Native World, Bawana Haguziki, KW Don 7, and so many others. Thank you all for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be starting on page 148 of Up from Slavery, which is chapter 10, a harder task than making bricks without straw. From the very beginning, at Tuskegee, I was determined to have the students do not only the agricultural and domestic work, but to have them erect their own buildings. My plan was to have them, while performing this service, taught the latest and best methods of labor so that the school would not only get the benefit of their efforts, but the students themselves would be taught to see not only utility in labor, but beauty and dignity would be taught. In fact, how to lift labor up from mere drudgery and toil and would learn to love work for its own sake. My plan was not to teach them to work the old way, but to show them to make the forces of nature, air, water, steam, electricity, and horsepower assist them in their labor. So he wanted them to use technology in their labor. He wanted them to know how to use technology in their labor. At first, many advised against the experiment of having the buildings erected by the labor of students, but I was determined to stick to it. I told those who doubted the wisdom of the plan that I knew that our first buildings would not be so comfortable or so complete in their finish as the buildings erected by the experienced hands of outside workmen, but that in the teaching of civilization, self-help, and self-reliance, the erection of the buildings by the students themselves would more than compensate for any lack of comfort or finish. I further told those who doubted the wisdom of this plan that the majority of our students who came to us in poverty from cabins of the cotton, sugar, and rice plantations of the South, and that while I knew it would please the students very much to place them at once in finely constructed buildings, I felt that it would be following out a more natural process of development to teach them how to construct their own buildings. Mistakes I knew would be made, but these mistakes would teach us valuable lessons for the future. During the now 19 years existence of the Tuskegee School, the plan of having the buildings erected by student labor has been adhered to. In this time, 40 buildings, counting small and large, have been built, and all except 4 are almost wholly the product of student labor. As an additional result, hundreds of men are now scattered throughout the South who received their knowledge of mechanics while being taught how to erect these buildings. Skill and knowledge are now handed down from one set of students to another in this way, until at the present time, a building of any description or size can be constructed wholly by our instructors and students, from the drawing of the plans to the putting in of the electric fixtures, without going off the grounds for a single workman. Not a few times, when a new student has been led into the temptation of marring the looks of some buildings by lead pencil marks or by the cuts of a jackknife, I have heard an old student remind him, "Don't do that. That is our building. I helped put it up." In the early days of the school, I think my most trying experience was in the matter of brick making. As soon as we got the farm work reasonably well started, we directed our next efforts toward the industry of making bricks. We needed these for use in connection with the erection of our own buildings, but there was also another reason for establishing this industry. There was no brickyard in the town, and in addition to our own needs, there was a demand for bricks in the market. So he had analyzed the market and saw that if they started making bricks, they could also make money. I have always sympathized with the children of Israel in their task of making bricks without straw, but ours was the task of making bricks with no money and no experience. In the first place, the work was hard and dirty, and it was difficult to get the students to help. When it came to brick making, their distaste for manual labor in connection with book education became especially manifest. It was not a pleasant task for one to stand in the mud pit for hours with mud up to his knees. More than one man became disgusted and left the school. We tried several locations before we opened up a pit that furnished brick clay. I had always supposed that brick making was very simple, but I soon found out by bitter experience that it required special skill and knowledge, particularly in the burning of the bricks. After a good deal of effort, we molded about 25,000 bricks and put them into a kiln to be burned. This kiln turned out to be a failure because it was not properly constructed or properly burned. We began at once, however, on a second kiln. For this, for some reason, also proved a failure. The failure of this kiln made it still more difficult to get the students to take any part in the work. Several of the teachers, however, who had been trained in the industries at Hampton, volunteered their services. And in some way, we succeeded in getting a third kiln ready for burning. The burning of a kiln required about a week. Toward the latter part of the week, when it seemed as if we were going to have a good many thousand bricks in a few hours, in the middle of the night, the kiln fell. For the third time, we had failed. The failure of this last kiln left me without a single dollar with which to make another experiment. Most of the teachers advised at the abandoning of the effort to make bricks. In the midst of my troubles, I thought of a watch which had come into my possession years before. I took this watch to the city of Montgomery, which was not far distant, and placed it in a pawn shop. I secured cash upon it to the amount of $15 with which to renew the brickmaking experiment. I returned to Tuskegee and, with the help of the $15, rallied our rather demoralized and discouraged forces and began a fourth attempt to make bricks. This time, I am glad to say, we were successful. Before I had got a hold of any money, the time limit on my watch had expired, and I have never seen it since, but I have never regretted the loss of it. Brickmaking has now become such an important industry at the school that last season our students manufactured 1,200,000 of first-class bricks of a quality suitable to be sold in any market. Aside from this, scores of young men have mastered the brickmaking trade, both in the making of bricks by hand and by machinery, and are now engaged in this industry in many parts of the South. Greetings, Brother Bakari. How are you tonight? The making of these bricks taught me an important lesson in regard to the relations of the two races in the South. Many white people who had no contact with the school and perhaps no sympathy with it came to us to buy bricks because they found that ours were good bricks. They discovered that we were supplying a real want in the community. The making of these bricks caused many of the white residents of the neighborhood to begin to feel that the education of the Negro was not making him worthless, but that in educating our students, we were adding something to the wealth and comfort of the community. As the people of the neighborhood came to us to buy bricks, we got acquainted with them. They traded with us and we with them. Our business interests became intermingled. We had something which they wanted, they had something which we wanted. This, in a large measure, helped to lay the foundation for the pleasant relations that have continued to exist between us and the white people in that section, and which now extend throughout the South. Whenever one of our brickmakers has gone in the South, we find that he has something to contribute to the well-being of the community into which he has gone, something that has made the community feel that, in a degree, it is indebted to him, and perhaps to a certain extent, dependent upon him. In this way, pleasant relations between the races have been stimulated. My experience is that there is something in human nature which always makes an individual recognize and reward merit, no matter under what color of skin merit is found. I have found too that it is the visible, the tangible, that goes a long ways in softening prejudices. The actual sight of a first-class house that a Negro has built is 10 times more potent than the pages of discussion about a house that he ought to build or perhaps could build. The same principle of industrial education has been carried out in the building of our own wagons, carts, and buggies from the first. We now own and use on our farm and about the school dozens of these vehicles, and every one of them was built by the hands of the students. Aside from this, we help supply the local market with these vehicles. The supplying of them to the people in the community has had the same effect as supplying of the bricks, and the man who learns at Tuskegee to build and repair wagons and carts is regarded as a benefactor by both races in the community where he goes. The people with whom he lives and works are going to think twice before they part with such a man. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you tonight? The individual who can do something that the world wants done will, in the end, make his way regardless of his race. One man may go into a community prepared to supply the people there with an analysis of Greek sentences. The community may not at that time be prepared for or feel the need of Greek analysis, but it may feel its need of bricks and houses and wagons. If the man can supply the need for those, then it will lead eventually to a demand for the first product, and with the demand will come the ability to appreciate it and profit by it. About the time that we succeeded in burning our first kiln of bricks, we began facing an emphasized form of objection of the students to being taught to work. By this time, it had gotten to be pretty well advertised throughout the state that every student who came to Tuskegee, no matter what his financial ability might be, must learn some industry. Quite a number of letters came from parents protesting against their children engaging in labor while they were in school. Other parents came to the school to protest in person. Many of the new students brought a written or verbal request from their parents to the effect that they wanted their children taught nothing but books. The more books, the larger they were, and the longer the titles printed upon them, the better pleased the students and their parents seemed to be. I gave little heed to these protests, except that I lost no opportunity to go into as many parts of the state as I could for the purpose of speaking to the parents and showing them the value of industrial education. Besides, I talked to the students constantly on the subject. Notwithstanding the unpopularity of the industrial work, the school continued to increase in numbers to such an extent that by the middle of the second year, there was an attendance of about 150, representing almost all parts of the state of Alabama and including a few from other states. In the summer of 1882, Miss Davison and I both went north and engaged in the work of raising funds for the completion of our new building. On my way north, I stopped in New York City to try to get a letter of recommendation from an officer of a missionary organization who had become somewhat acquainted with me for a few years previous. This man not only refused to give me the letter, but he advised me most earnestly to go back home at once and not make an attempt to get money, for he was quite sure that I would never get more than enough to pay for my traveling expenses. I thanked him for his advice and proceeded on my journey. The first place I went to in the north was Northampton, Massachusetts, where I spent nearly half a day in looking for a colored family with whom I could board, never dreaming that any hotel would admit me. I was greatly surprised when I found that I would have no trouble in being accommodated at a hotel. We were successful in getting money enough so that on Thanksgiving Day of that year, we held our first service in the chapel of Porter Hall, although the building was not completed. Greetings, Forecast. In looking about for someone to preach the Thanksgiving sermon, I found one of the rarest men that it has ever been my privilege to know. That was Reverend Robert C. Bedford, a white man from Wisconsin who was the pastor of a little colored congregational church in Montgomery, Alabama. Before going to Montgomery to look for someone to preach this sermon, I had never heard of Mr. Bedford. He had never heard of me. He gladly consented to come to Tuskegee and hold the Thanksgiving service. It was the first service of this kind that the colored people there ever had observed, and what a deep interest they manifested in it. The sight of the new building made it a day of thanksgiving for them never to be forgotten. Mr. Bedford consented to become one of the trustees of the school, and in that capacity, and as a worker for it, he has been connected with it for 18 years. During this time, he has borne the school upon his heart day and night, and is never so happy as when he is performing some service, no matter how humble, for it. He completely obliterates himself in everything and looks only for permission to serve where service is most disagreeable and where others would not be attracted. In all my relations with him, he has seemed to me to approach as nearly to the spirit of the master as almost any man I have ever met. A little later, there came into the service of the school another man, quite young at the time and fresh from Hampton, without whose service the school could never have become what it is. This man was Mr. Warren Logan, who now, for 17 years, has been the treasurer of the Institute and the acting principal during my absence. He has always shown a degree of unselfishness and an amount of business tact coupled with a clear judgment that has kept the school in good condition no matter how long I have been absent from it. During all the financial stress through which the school has passed, his patience and faith in our ultimate success have not left him. As soon as our first building was near enough to completion so that we could occupy a portion of it, which was near the middle of the second year of the school, we opened a boarding department. Students began coming from quite a distance, and in such increasing numbers that we felt more and more that we were merely skimming over the surface and that we were not getting hold of the students in their home life. We had nothing but the students and their appetites with which to begin a boarding department. No provision had been made in the new building for a kitchen and dining room, but we discovered that by digging out a large amount of earth from under the building, we could make a partially lighted basement room that could be used for a kitchen and dining room. Again, I called on the assistance of students to volunteer for work, this time to assist in the digging out of the basement. This they did, and in a few weeks we had a place to cook and eat in, although it was very rough and uncomfortable. And anyone seeing the place now would never believe that it was used once for a dining room. The most serious problem, though, was to get the boarding department started off in running order. With nothing to do in it within the way of furniture, and with no money with which to buy anything, the merchants of the town would let us have what food we wanted on credit. In fact, in those earlier years, I was constantly embarrassed because people seemed to have more faith in me than I had in myself. It was pretty hard to cook, however, without stoves, and awkward to eat without dishes. At first, the cooking was done out of doors in the old-fashioned primitive style in pots and skillets placed over a fire. Some of the carpenter's benches that had been used in the construction of the building were utilized for tables. As for dishes, there were too few to make it worthwhile to spend time in describing them. No one connected with the boarding department seemed to have any idea that meals must be served at certain fixed and regular hours, and this was a source of great worry. Everything was so out of joint and so inconvenient that I feel safe in saying that for the first 2 weeks, something was wrong at every meal. Either the meat was not done or had been burnt, or the salt had been left out of the bread, or the tea had been forgotten. Early one morning, I was standing near the dining room door and listened to the complaints of the students. The complaints that morning were especially emphatic and numerous because the whole breakfast had been a failure. One of the girls who had failed to get any breakfast came out and went to the well to draw some water to drink and take the place of the breakfast which she had not been able to get. When she reached the well, she found that the rope was broken and she could get no water. She turned from the well and said in the most discouraged tone, not knowing that I was where I could hear her, "We can't even get water to drink at this school." I think no one remark ever came so near discouraging me as that one. At another time, when Mr. Bedford, whom I have already spoken of as one of our trustees and a devoted friend of the institution, was visiting the school, he was given a bedroom immediately over the dining room. Early in the morning, he was awakened by a rather animated discussion between two boys in the dining room below. The discussion was over the question as to whose turn it was to use the coffee cup that morning. One boy won the case by proving that for 3 mornings he had not had an opportunity to use the cup at all. But gradually, by patience and hard work, we brought order out of the chaos. Just as will be true of any problem if we stick to it with patience and wisdom and earnest effort. As I look back now over that part of our struggle, I am glad we had it. I am glad that we endured those discomforts and inconveniences. I am glad that our students had to dig out a place for their kitchen and dining room. I am glad that our first boarding place was in the dismal, ill-lighted, and damp basement. Had we started in a fine, attractive, convenient room, I fear we would have lost our heads and become stuck up. It means a great deal, I think, to start off on a foundation which one has made for oneself. When our old students return to Tuskegee now, as they often do, and go into our large, beautiful, well-ventilated and well-lighted dining room and see tempting, well-cooked food, largely grown by the students themselves, and see tables, neat tablecloths, napkins, and vases of flowers upon the tables, and hear singing birds, and note that each meal is exactly served upon the minute with no disorder and with almost no complaint from the hundreds that now fill our dining room, they too often say to me that they are glad that we started where we did and built ourselves up year by year by a slow and natural process of growth. Chapter 11. Making their beds before they could lie on them. A little later in the history of the school, we had a visit from General J.F.B. Marshall, the treasurer of the Hampton Institute, who had faith enough to lend us the first $250 with which to make a payment down on the farm. He remained with us a week and made a careful inspection of everything. He seemed well pleased with our progress and wrote back interesting and encouraging reports to Hampton. A little later, Miss Mary F. Mackey, the teacher who had given me the sweeping examination when I entered Hampton, came to see us, and still later, General Armstrong came himself. At the time of these visits, these Hampton friends and the number of teachers at Tuskegee had increased considerably, and most of the new teachers were graduates of the Hampton Institute. We gave our Hampton friends, especially General Armstrong, a cordial welcome. They were all surprised and pleased at the progress that the school had made within so short a time. The colored people from miles around came to the school to get a look at General Armstrong, about whom they had heard so much. The general was not only welcomed by the members of my own race, but by the Southern white people as well. This first visit, which General Armstrong made to Tuskegee, gave me an opportunity to get an insight into his character such as I had not before had. I referred to his interest in the Southern white people. Before this, I had had the thought that General Armstrong, having fought the Southern white man, rather cherished a feeling of bitterness toward the white South and was interested in helping only the colored man there. But this visit convinced me that I did not know the greatness of the generosity of the man. I soon learned by his visits to the Southern white people and from his conversations with them that he was anxious about the prosperity and happiness of the white race as the black. He cherished no bitterness against the South and was happy when an opportunity offered for manifesting his sympathy. I never heard him speak in public or in private a single bitter word against the white man in the South. From his example, in this respect, I learned the lesson that great men cultivate love and that only little men cherish a spirit of hatred. I learned that assistance given to the weak makes one who gives it strong, and that oppression of the unfortunate makes one weak. It is now long ago that I learned this lesson from General Armstrong and resolved that I would permit no man, no matter what his color might be, to narrow and degrade my soul by making me hate him. With God's help, I believe that I have completely rid myself of any ill feeling toward the Southern white man for any wrong he may have inflicted upon my race. I am made to feel just as happy now when I am rendering service to Southern white men as when the service is rendered to a member of my own race. I pity from the bottom of my heart any individual who is so unfortunate as to get into the habit of holding race prejudice. The more I consider the subject, the more strongly I am convinced that the most harmful effect of the practice to which the people in certain sections of the South have felt themselves compelled to resort in order to get rid of the force of the Negro's ballot is not wholly in the wrong done to the Negroes, but in the permanent injury to the morals of the white man. The wrong to the Negro is temporary, but the morals of the white man, the injury is permanent. I have noted time and time again that when an individual perjures himself in order to break the force of the black man's ballot, he soon learns to practice dishonesty in other relations of life, not only where the Negro is concerned, but equally so where a white man is concerned. The white man who begins by cheating a Negro usually ends by cheating a white man. The white man who begins to break the law by lynching a Negro soon yields to the temptation to lynch a white man. All this, it seems to me, makes it important that the whole nation lend a hand in trying to lift the burden and ignorance from the South. Another thing that is becoming more apparent each year in the development of the education in the South is the influence of General Armstrong's idea of education. And this not upon the blacks alone, but upon the whites also. At the present time, there is almost no Southern state that is putting forth efforts in the direction of securing industrial education for its white boys and girls. And in most cases, it is easy to trace the history of these efforts back to General Armstrong. Soon after the opening of our humble boarding department, students began coming to us in still larger numbers. For weeks, we not only had to contend with the difficulty of providing board with no money, but also with that of providing sleeping accommodations. For this purpose, we rented a number of cabins near the school. These cabins were in a dilapidated condition, and during the winter months, the students who occupied them necessarily suffered from the cold. We charged the students $8 a month, all they were able to pay, for their board. This included, besides board, room, fuel, and washing. We also gave the students credit on their board bills for all the work they did for the school, which was of any value to the institute. The cost of tuition, which was $50 a year for each student, we had to secure then, as now, wherever we could. This small charge in cash gave us no capital with which to start a boarding department. The weather during the second winter of our work was very cold. We were not able to provide enough bedclothes to keep the students warm. In fact, for some time, we were not able to provide, except in a few cases, bedsteads and mattresses of any kind. During the coldest nights, I was so troubled about the discomfort of the students that I could not sleep myself. I recall that on several occasions, I went in the middle of the night to the shanties occupied by the young men for the purposes of comforting them. I often found some of them sitting huddled around a fire with one blanket which we had been able to provide wrapped around them, trying in this way to keep warm. During the whole night, some of them did not attempt to lie down. One morning, when the night previous had been unusually cold, I asked of those I asked those of students I asked those of the students in the chapel who thought that they had been frostbitten during the night to raise their hand. 3 hands went up. Notwithstanding these experiences, there was almost no complaining on the part of the students. They knew that we were doing the best we could for them. They were happy in the privilege of being permitted to enjoy any kind of opportunity that would enable them to improve their condition. They were constantly asking that what they might do to lighten the burdens of the teachers. I have heard it stated more than once, both in North and in the South, that colored people could not obey and respect each other when one member of the race is placed in a position of authority over others. In regard to this general belief and these statements, I can say that during the 19 years of my experience at Tuskegee, I never, either by word or act, have been treated with disrespect by any student or officer connected with the institution. On the other hand, I am constantly embarrassed by the many acts of thoughtful kindness. The students do not seem to want me to carry a large book or a satchel or any kind of a burden throughout the grounds. In such cases, more than one always offers to relieve me. I almost never go out of my office when the rain is falling that some student does not come to my side with an umbrella and ask to be allowed to hold it over me. While writing upon this subject, it is a pleasure for me to add that in all my contact with the white people of the South, I have never received a single personal insult. The white people in and near Tuskegee, to an especial degree, seem to count it a privilege to show me all the respect within their power and often go out of their way to do this. Not very long ago, I was making a journey between Dallas, Texas, and Houston. In some way, it became known in advance that I was on the train. At nearly every station at which the train stopped, numbers of white people, including, in most cases, the officials of the town, came aboard and introduced themselves and thanked me heartily for the work I was trying to do for the South. On another occasion, when I was making a trip from Augusta, Georgia to Atlanta, Being rather tired from travel, I rode in a Pullman sleeper. When I went into the car, I found there two ladies from Boston whom I knew well. These good ladies were perfectly ignorant, it seems, of the customs of the South, and in the goodness of their hearts insisted that I take a seat with them in their section. After some hesitation, I consented. I had been there for but a few minutes when one of them, without my knowledge, ordered supper to be served to the three of us. This embarrassed me further still. The car was full of Southern white men, most of whom had their eyes upon our party. When I found that supper had been ordered, I tried to contrive some excuse that would permit me to leave the section, but the ladies insisted that I must eat with them. I finally settled myself back in my seat with a sigh and said to myself, I am in for it now for sure. As to add further to the embarrassment of the situation, soon after the supper was placed on the table, one of the ladies remembered that she had in her satchel a special kind of tea which she wished to be served. And as she said, she felt quite sure the porter did not know how to brew it properly. She she insisted upon getting up and preparing it and serving it herself. At last the meal was over, and it seemed like the longest one I had ever eaten. We were through. When we were through, I decided to get myself out of the embarrassing situation and go into the smoking room, where most of the men were by that time, to see how the land lay. In the meantime, however, it had become known in some way throughout the car who I was. When I went into the smoking room, I was never more surprised in my life than when each man, nearly every one of them citizens of Georgia, came up and introduced himself to me and thanked me earnestly for the work I was trying to do for the whole South. This was not flattery because each one of these individuals knew that he had nothing to gain by trying to flatter me. From the first, I have sought to impress the students with the idea that Tuskegee is not my institution or that the officers or that of the officers, but that it is their institution and that they have as much an interest in it as the trustees or instructors. I have further sought to have them feel that I am not at the institution as their friend and advisor and not as an overseer. It has been my aim to have them speak with directness and frankness about anything that concerns the life of the school. 2 or 3 times a year, I ask the students to write me a letter criticizing or making complaints or suggestions about anything connected with the institution. When this is not done, I have them meet me in the chapel for a heart-to-heart talk about the conduct of the school. There are no meetings with our students that I enjoy more than these, and none are more helpful to me in planning for the future. These meetings, it seems to me, enable me to get at the very heart of all that concerns the school. Few things help an individual more than to place responsibility upon him and to let him know that you trust him. When I have read of labor troubles between employers and employees, I have often thought that many strikes and similar disturbances might be avoided if the employers would cultivate the habit of getting nearer to their employees, of consulting and advising them and letting them feel that the interests of the two are the same. Every individual responds to confidence, and this is not more true of any race than of the Negroes. Let them once understand that you are unselfishly interested in them and you can lead them to any extent. It was my aim from the first at Tuskegee to not only have the buildings erected by the students themselves, but to have them make their own furniture as far as possible. I now marvel at the patience of the students while sleeping upon the floor while waiting for some kind of bedstead to be constructed, or if they're sleeping without any kind of mattress while waiting for something that looked like a mattress to be made. In the early days, we had very few students who had been used to handling carpenter's tools, and bedsteads made by the students then were very rough and very weak. Not unfrequently, when I went into the students' rooms in the morning, I would find at least two bedsteads lying about on the floor. The problem of providing mattresses was a difficult one to solve. We finally mastered this, however, by getting some cheap cloth and sewing pieces of this together as to make large bags. These bags we filled with pine straw, or, as it is sometimes called, pine needles, which we secured from the forest nearby. I am glad to say that the industry of mattress making has grown steadily since then and has been improved to such an extent that at the present time it is an important branch of the work which is taught systematically to a number of our girls, and that the mattresses that now come out of the mattress shop at Tuskegee are as good as those bought in the average store. For some time after the opening of the boarding department, we had no chairs in the students' bedrooms or in the dining rooms. Instead of chairs, we used stools which the students constructed by nailing together three pieces of rough board. As a rule, the furniture in the students' rooms during the early days of the school consisted of a bed, some stools, sometimes a rough table made by the students. The plan of having the students make the furniture is still followed, but the number of pieces in a room has been quite increased, and the workmanship has so improved that little fault can be found with the articles now. One thing that I have always insisted upon at Tuskegee is that everywhere there should be absolute cleanliness. Over and over again, the students were reminded in those first years, and are reminded now, that people would excuse us for our poverty, for our lack of comforts and conveniences, but that they would not excuse us for dirt. Another thing that has been insisted upon at the school is the use of the toothbrush. The gospel of the toothbrush, as General Armstrong used to call it, is part of our creed at Tuskegee. No student is permitted to remain who does not keep and use a toothbrush. Several times in recent years, students have come to us who brought with them almost no other article except a toothbrush. They had heard from the lips of other students about our insisting upon the use of this, and so to make a good impression, they brought at least a toothbrush with them. I remember that one morning not long ago, I went with the lady principal on her usual morning tour of inspection of the girls' rooms. We found one room that contained three girls who had recently arrived at the school. When I asked them if they had toothbrushes, one of the girls replied, pointing to a brush, "Yes, sir, that is our brush. We brought it together yesterday." It did not take them long to learn a different lesson. It has been interesting to note the effect that the use of the toothbrush has had on bringing out about a higher degree of civilization among the students. With few exceptions, I have noticed that if we can get a student to the point where the first or second toothbrush disappears, he is of his own motion buys another. He of his own motion buys another. I have not been disappointed in the future of that individual. Absolute cleanliness of the body has been insisted upon from the first. The students have been taught to bathe as regularly as they take their meals. This lesson we began teaching before we had anything in the shape of a bathhouse. Most of the students came from plantation districts, and often we had to teach them how to sleep at night. That is, whether between the two sheets after we got to the point where we could provide them two sheets or under both of them. Naturally, I found it difficult to teach them to sleep between two sheets when we were able to supply but one. The importance of the use of the nightgown received the same attention. For a long time, one of the most difficult tasks was to teach students that all the buttons were to be kept on their clothes and that there must be no torn pieces and no grease spots. This lesson, I am pleased to be able to say, has been so thoroughly learned and so faithfully handed down from year to year, one by one, from one set of students to another, that often at the present time, when the students march out of the chapel in the evening and their dress is inspected, as it is every night, not one button is to be found missing. And that was the end of chapter 11. But as you can see, he had great pride in the things that he was teaching in the hygiene department to the students at Tuskegee, and pride in showing the students the beauty and dignity of manual labor. It seems as if he wanted them to understand that hygiene was key because people could forgive their poverty, people could forgive them being out of sorts, people could forgive a lot. But what they could not forgive was they could not forgive them being dirty. And so they had to master the hygiene portion of it. They had to master being clean. They had to master basic etiquette and basic householding skills, to sleep in between two sheets, to eat with dishes and plates, to use a toothbrush, to brush their hair, to clean under their nails, to keep the buttons on their clothes. So there are a lot of things that they had to learn. And he seems to really revere and respect the white people that he came in contact with, so much so that he puts them on a pedestal. I think that there's a unique fascination that we have with white people, because it's almost as if they hold some Glimmerman style mystique to us. And coming out of slavery, I can only imagine that that was amplified because Booker T. Washington rose to the ranks of being almost accepted by these people in a way, because these people from all over, whenever he was on the train or whenever he traveled, they wanted to thank him for the work that he was trying to do at the South. And, he says, he tries to keep it humble, but I still think that there is a level of pride there in being accepted by these white people. So those are just my thoughts and opinions. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I want to thank Oni from the Pro Black Perspective, Brother Bakari, Anthony McPhail, and the Forecast for being here. Thank you so much for my cash apps and shout outs. I appreciate each and every one of you. I know that Afro Native is listening. I know that Sister Ra and the elders are listening. I know that KW Don 7 is listening. I know that the children at Jesse's Kids are listening. I know that the children at the Daycare Ladies Network are listening. And I know that even you are listening now. So I thank each and every one of you, and I will see you tomorrow. Peace, guys.